I want to go to London now. This guy's the author of a new book called The New Depression. I don't agree with him on his solutions, but I want to hear his case. Richard Duncan, how are you, Richard?
I'm well, thanks.
Good.
How are you?
I'm good. We got off the gold standard in 1968. I mean, what you just said is so absolutely right on the money. If you heard the monologue with Alan Greenspan saying, we're going to pay our debts. Of course we're going to pay our debts. The United States can always just print money. That's crazy.
Right. I think this 50 trillion explosion of credit that occurred over the last 45 years, it not only made the global economy and the U.S. economy much bigger, I really think it changed the nature of the economic system itself. We evolved from capitalism into what I now call creditism.
Which is what? Just that we live on credit, all of us.
Well, under capitalism, the government played very little role. But the system we have now is entirely different. In our system, the U.S. government spends 24% of GDP. In other words, $1 out of every 4 the government spends. And on top of that, the Fed creates the money and manipulates its value. Well, that's not capitalism.
Okay.
But on top of that, it's very interesting that under capitalism, the growth dynamic was driven by businessmen who would invest and make a profit and save or accumulate capital, hence capitalism. And that was the way capitalism created growth. But that's not the way our system now has worked for decades. Our system has worked by the growth dynamic is credit creation and consumption, and more credit creation and more consumption. And that created rapid economic growth, but it now looks like this creditism can't expand any further because the private sector can't bear any more debt.
Okay. You say that we are going to collapse into a Great Depression. How long before that? And what does that look like? To explain that to the average American and what that looks like.
Well, in Chapter 8 of my book, I try to be absolutely as scary as possible. It's called Disaster Scenarios. And I describe what a Great Depression would mean at home in the United States as well as globally. And so that's what we need to avoid at all cost. Now, the trick is, I think you're a follower of the Austrian economist, Ludwig von Mises, and they understood that when you create credit, it creates an artificial boom. And they also understood that the day always comes when the credit stops expanding. And at that point, then the prosperity created by the credit, well, it doesn't just flatten out at a very high level of prosperity. It then all spirals downward in reverse. And that is the Depression. So after a 45-year-long, $50 trillion credit-induced global boom, if we now permit the credit to stop expanding, then the depression that we have will be so severe. I mean, honestly, I don't think our civilization could survive it. It's not certain that democracy could survive that sort of crisis.
Wait, please expand, because when people say to me, Glenn, you believe the economy is going to collapse. I do. But they say, well, what does that mean? And I say, I don't think we survive. I don't know exactly even what I mean by that. Explain when you say, I don't think our civilization will survive. What do you mean by that?
Okay, well, let's say the banking system fails. That destroys everyone's savings overnight. So suddenly your ATM machine doesn't work, you have no cash, you've lost your job, and the government no longer has any tax income, so they can't provide you any welfare or Social Security or Medicare. And so people are beginning to starve, and the crime wave explodes. Meanwhile, they can't afford to maintain the military bases overseas, so all the soldiers come home, and we no longer have a global empire as we do at the moment. Global trade breaks down, and China's economy implodes because it's dependent on export-led growth to the U.S. That would stop. China's economy would implode. The geopolitical consequences of a collapse of global trade could very well lead to war, as the Depression led to World War II.
Give me a comparison to to the Depression in the 1930s to what it would be like here now.
Well, first of all, I think it's important and interesting to understand that these two crises have come about in the same way. The Great Depression originated, in my opinion, when World War I started. At that point, all the European nations went to war. They didn't have enough gold to fight the war, so they went off the gold standard and started printing a lot of paper money and issuing a lot of government debt.
And went to us.
And that created a worldwide credit boom that we call the Roaring Twenties. But in 1930, the credit couldn't be repaid, and the international banking system collapsed, and global finance collapsed, and international trade collapsed, and the U.S. collapsed into a Great Depression. GDP contracted by 46%, and unemployment ranged from 15% to 25% for 10 years until World War II started. And at that point, then U.S. government spending increased 900%, and that ended the Depression, but of course 60 million people died during the war. Now this time the pattern is exactly the same. This time the Bretton Woods system broke down in 1971. That was a kind of gold standard. Afterwards, the government started issuing enormous amounts of government debt and more paper money. This has created a 4-decade-long global boom, but in 2008, the credit couldn't be repaid, and the international banking system started to collapse, and global trade started to collapse. But this time, the governments have jumped in with a very aggressive policy response to prevent any sort of return to a market-determined equilibrium, because they fear that that kind of equilibrium would mean the economy would contract by a third or 40% relative to what it was in 2006. And they fear that we couldn't survive that.
All right, give me
so that
give me
the policy response.
Give me a real short answer on this, and then we're going to get to a couple of solutions from you. One is how long do you think we would have before a collapse?
Well, right now, we would have collapsed already. We have a $16 trillion economy in the U.S. Well, now the U.S. budget deficit is $1.3 trillion. If you balance the budget, then immediately we have a $14.7 trillion economy instead of a $16 trillion economy. But meanwhile, so many people lose their jobs when the government balances the budget that consumption drops, and business profits drop, and business investment drop, so we immediately spiral into a depression. So it truly is only these trillion-dollar budget deficits that have prevented us from collapsing into a depression already. I mean, it's very shameful and embarrassing that that's the truth, but that is the only thing that's kept us out of a depression.
I agree with you on, I agree with you on that, but we're only making this hole bigger and deeper. I mean, it would have been a lot better for us, in my opinion, to take our lumps long ago instead of keep putting bubble on top of bubble on top of bubble.
Right. If we had done this in the early 80s, then we wouldn't be in this disaster now. But I think people underestimate the kind of lump that we would take if it corrects now. I mean, I really think, there is no deader than dead. If this spirals down into a debt deflation death spiral, then we're not going to recover, not in a few years, not in a generation, maybe not in several generations. I mean, when Rome collapsed, there was a recovery, but it took 9 centuries. It was called the Renaissance. That's the sort of situation we're looking at. If we allow this credit bubble to implode.
Why? If you get government out of the way and you free up American ingenuity and free up our resources, we have the resources. We have the ingenuity. I mean, we may not be where we are today, but, life wouldn't be bad as the Waltons, quite honestly, as long as we can flush the toilets indoors.
Well, the truth is our entire economy now has been built on this credit and government debt and government spending. Almost every major industry in the United States is somehow or the other subsidized by the U.S. government. More than 50% of the households receive some sort of government support. If you take all that away, that's not going to free up ingenuity. It's going to lead to starvation. You can't, as sad as it is, the starting point here is to understand we don't have capitalism. We have a government-directed creditism, credit-based system, and the question is, are we going to allow this system that we really do have, are we going to allow it to collapse, or are we going to somehow fix it?
And
there's no point in talking about trying to fix the crisis in capitalism. Right. We don't have capitalism.
Okay, but your fix on creditism is more credit, it's more spending, isn't it?
Well, there are only 4 parts to every economy: consumption, business investment, net trade, and government spending. In the U.S., consumption is about 70%, business investment 16%, net trade is a negative number because we have such a big trade deficit, -4, and the government's about 20%. Now, if if we cut so we have really three ways forward. We could balance the budget immediately, which would result in an immediate spiral into depression. That's option one. That's the worst possible option. Option two is we can keep doing what we're doing now, which is having trillion-dollar budget deficits and paying for it with paper money creation. And we can keep doing that for another 5 years quite easily, and probably 10 years. But then in about 10 years, the U.S. government would be as bankrupt as Greece, and then we collapse into a new Great Depression. That's option two. That's a lot better than option one, because it's always better to die tomorrow than die today. But the best option would be option three, to understand that we are dependent on credit. But so the government continues to borrow and spend, but instead of borrowing and spending all this money wastefully on too much consumption and war, they should actually change the way they spend the money. Rather than consume it all, they should invest it. And I don't mean patching up the roads and bridges. I mean in transformative 21st century technologies like renewable energy, genetic engineering, biotechnology, nanotechnology, so that the United States can actually develop new industries. And if we did that on an aggressive enough scale, we could lock in another American century. We would have an unassailable lead in these 21st century technologies, and we could generate such massive investment returns from these sorts of investments that we wouldn't have to collapse at all. Not 10 years out, not next year, never. We could lock in generations of future prosperity. Those are our options.
The name of the book is The New Depression, The Breakdown of the Paper Money Economy. Thank you very much, sir. It's been an unbelievable conversation with you, Richard. I hope to have you on again.